Welcome again to Rejected Knowledge. Bunch of stuff that's irrefutably proven true that nearly everybody cannot accept. And as a result of all this rejected knowledge, of course, well, you know the rest. Read Hosea 4:6. At any rate, we're now going to get into another book by James Montgomery. This one is called A Country Defeated in Victory. I believe he wrote this book before he wrote any of the others I've presented to you. So let's get into this. Again, where does James Montgomery's work come from? Well, he was on atgpress.com. That stood for againstthegrainpress.com. That website is down, most lamentably. I hope somebody puts that back up. This is vital information. You can't understand, you literally cannot understand the nature of the nation, the nature of the slavery we're in, without this information. This guy did it. This guy, James Montgomery, spent years proving this. He did the wet work, so to speak. Him, and the Informer, those two guys. Knowledge is Freedom was the button you would click on the old ATG Press if you wanted to read James Montgomery's crucial work. At any rate, let's get to it. A Country Defeated in Victory by James Montgomery, Part 1. To understand the title of this paper, you must be made aware that the country I refer to is the United States. Very few Americans are aware of the defeat of which it is my obligation to inform you of. President Lincoln, very wisely and correctly so, I might add, said that all the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not, by force, take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up from among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. Unquote, that by Abraham Lincoln. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies, unquote. These patriarchs of our country understood the dangers of banking and the men that controlled the banking institutions. The enemy that defeated this country from the very beginning was the debt created by the use of paper money instead of gold and silver coin. The use of differing weights and measures caused this country to fall prey to the international bankers. Prior to the Constitution being written, the states printed paper money to finance the Revolutionary War. At the end of the war, the new United States found itself bankrupted by a huge debt. Our forefathers made it clear, because of their experience and those of other countries, that we should never use paper money again. Here is a series of quotes. A quote by John Adams, quote, I am firmly of the opinion that there never was a paper pound, a paper dollar, or a paper promise of any kind that ever yet obtained the general currency as money, but by force or fraud, generally by both, unquote. That again by John Adams. The following quote is by Count d'Astute de Tracy, quote, a theft of greater magnitude and still more ruinous is the making of paper money. It is greater because in this money there is absolutely no real value. It is more ruinous because, by its gradual depreciation during the time of its existence, it produces the effect which would be proration of the coins. All those iniquities are founded on the false idea the money is but a sign." Unquote. That quote again by Count d'Estoute de Tracy. The following is a quote by George Washington. Quote, "If ever again our nation stumbles upon unfunded paper, it shall surely be like death to our body politic. This country will crash." Unquote. That quote again by George Washington. A quote by C.C. Pinckney. "That paper money corrupted the morals of the people. It had diverted them from the paths of honest industry to the ways of ruinous speculation. It had destroyed both public and private credit, and had brought total ruin on numberless widows and orphans. I apprehend these general reasonings will be found true with respect to paper money. That experience has shown that in every state where it has been practiced since the Revolution, it always carries the gold and silver out of the country and impoverishes it." Unquote. That quote by C.C. Pinckney. During the formation of the Constitution, there were pro-paper and anti-paper money advocates at work. The strongest proponent for the use of paper money and the establishment of the first Bank of the United States was Alexander Hamilton. Many of our forefathers, including Thomas Jefferson, were against the use of paper money and the establishment of a central bank. The proponents for paper money said this would be more cost-effective and convenient than using silver and gold coin. Those against the use of paper money said this would ruin the country through debt and plunge this country into bankruptcy and make the Americans subject to the bankers. The following is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied." Unquote. That quote again by Thomas Jefferson. On February 15, 1791, Jefferson wrote to Washington to tell him his objections of the establishment of a national bank. The bill for establishing a national bank undertakes, among other things, 1. To form the subscribers into a corporation. 2. To enable them in their corporate capacities to receive grants of land, and so far is against the laws of Mortmain. 3. To make alien subscribers capable of holding lands, and so far is against the laws of alienage. 4. To transmit these lands, on the death of a proprietor, to a certain line of successors, and so far changes the course of descents. 5. To put the lands out of the reach of forfeiture or escheat, and so far is against the laws of forfeiture and escheat. 6. To transmit personal chattels to successors in a certain line, and so far is against the laws of distribution. 7. To give them the sole and exclusive right of banking under the national authority, and so far is against the laws of monopoly. 8. to communicate to them a power to make laws paramount to the laws of the states, for so they must be construed, to protect the institutions from the control of the state legislatures, and so probably they will be construed. I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by this Constitution. Can it be thought that the Constitution intended that for a shade or two of convenience, more or less, Congress should be authorized to break down the most ancient and fundamental laws of the several states, such as those against mortmain, the laws of alienage, the rules of descent, the acts of distribution, the laws of escheat and forfeiture, the laws of monopoly, unquote, that quote, of course, from Thomas Jefferson. What did Jefferson mean by the word mortmain? Well, this is a law that was passed prior to the Magna Carta. The reason this law was created by the King of England was to protect his land. When the church gained status in England, the people began to will their land to the church in exchange for the promise that the church would pray their souls out of hell. The public lands began to disappear, so the king enacted this law to protect his land. What the law, in effect, said was that no one could deed land to the church without a license from the king. This definition was later extended to include corporations. Jefferson said that because we were the sovereigns, Congress was subject to us. They had no right to give a corporate charter to the Bank of the United States, placing our land in dead hands, parentheses, unable to be purchased again by the public, end parentheses, since Congress had not been given this power under the Constitution. Any powers not given to Congress by the Constitution were reserved by the several states and the American people. Jefferson knew that if this charter was given, the public lands would soon belong to the bankers. As Thomas Jefferson said, this was a most ancient and fundamental law of the 13 states. Can our land be reclaimed by the law of mortmain? I don't know yet, but it bears looking into. Only sovereigns that are sui juris freemen and freeholders of their property can bring such a suit. I know from studying Blackstone's writings on mortmain that only a free man has a remedy and can bring the common law writ of quo warranto. Quo warranto means, quote, a writ brought before a proper tribunal to inquire by what warrant a person or corporation exercises certain powers, end quote. That from Blackstone's commentaries. Upon ratification of the Constitution, it had appeared that those who opposed paper money had won. The money clauses of the Constitution made it unlawful to coin anything except gold and silver. However, there was a fatal flaw in the Constitution. The words of the Constitution were twisted by lawyer legalese, and power was claimed by Congress that was not granted to them by the Constitution or the men that wrote the Constitution. Congress was granted exclusive jurisdiction over the District of Columbia and its territories, no more, no less. It will be shown in this paper how Congress extended, by legislation, its territory to include the 50 states. Imagine the District of Columbia as an umbrella, and that Congress opened this umbrella in order to cover the 50 states. Quote, this is a quote from Article 1, Section 8, paragraphs 16 and 17 of the U.S. Constitution. Quote, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or office thereof. Unquote. Again, that was Article 1, Section 8, paragraph 16 and 17 of the U.S. Constitution. The following quote is from Article 4, Section 3, paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Quote, the Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needed rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Unquote. That again from Article 4, Section 3, paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Hamilton suggested that the word proper gave Congress the power under the Constitution to charter the Bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson said in disagreement that, quote, the second general phrase is to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the enumerated powers. Unquote. But they can all be carried into execution without a bank. A bank, therefore, is not necessary, and consequently not authorized by this phrase. It has been urged that a bank will give great facility or convenience in the collection of taxes. Suppose this were true, yet the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient, for exercising the enumerated powers. Unquote. That quote from Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson lost his debate with Hamilton concerning the establishment of the Bank of the United States. Jefferson believed the Constitution was an exclusive, not an inclusive document, and was meant to be a restriction on Congress. This began the legal precedent of Congress and the courts claiming power not granted to them by the citizens of the states. Jefferson and the other sponsors of the 10th Amendment thought this amendment would be enough to check the power-hungry Congress, but they were wrong. Congress's assumption of undelegated powers made the following possible. There were two governments created by the Constitution. The following definitions will prove that one was bound by the Constitution, the other was not. The term, quote-unquote, United States may be used in any one of several senses. It may be merely the name of a sovereign occupying the position analogous to that of other sovereigns in the family of nations. It may designate the territory over which the sovereignty of the United States extends, or it may be the collective name of the states which are united by and under the Constitution. In exercising this power, Congress is not subject to the same constitutional limitations as when it is legislating for the United States. And in general, the guarantees of the Constitution, save as they are limitations upon the exercise of executive and legislative power, when exerted for or over our insular possessions, extend to them only as Congress, in the exercise of its legislative power over territory belonging to the United States, has made those guarantees applicable. And if you want proof on that, James Montgomery cites Hooven and Allison and Company versus Evatt, 324 U.S. 652 from the year 1945. The idea prevails with some indeed. It found expression in arguments at the bar that we have in this country substantially or practically two national governments. One to be maintained under the Constitution, with all its restrictions, the other to be maintained by Congress outside and independently of that instrument, by exercising such powers as other nations of the earth are accustomed to exercise. It will be an evil day for American liberty if the theory of government outside of the supreme law of the land finds lodgment in our constitutional jurisprudence. No higher authority rests upon this court than to exert its full authority to prevent all violation of the principles of the Constitution. And that was a quote. It was the dissenting opinion from Downs versus Bidwell, 182 U.S. 244 from the year 1901. Here's a quote from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, page 24, from the year 1992. Quote, "Nothing in this covenant requires or authorizes legislation or other action by the United States of America prohibited by the Constitution of the United States as interpreted by the United States." Wow. Legalese. When President Washington agreed with Hamilton to create a Bank of the United States, this country's fate was sealed. With Congress acting under its insular capacity, not restrained by the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, their only concern then became the furtherance of commerce, not the rights of Americans. The actions of Hamilton were directly responsible for the defeat of the American people. The American people, over the course of our history, have seen the events that enslaved them without realizing their enslavement, because their ability to buy and sell was never taken away. The following is a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "Our rulers will become corrupt, our people careless. The time for fixing every essential right on a legal basis is now, while our rulers are honest and ourselves united. From the conclusion of this war we shall be going downhill. It will not then be necessary to resort every moment to the people for support. They will be forgotten, therefore, and their rights disregarded. They will forget themselves, but in the sole faculty of making money, and will never think of uniting to effect a due respect for their rights. The shackles, therefore, which shall not be knocked off at the conclusion of this war, will remain on us long, will be made heavier and heavier, till our rights shall revive or expire in a convulsion." Unquote. That again from Thomas Jefferson. The American people were unaware of the hidden intent of the bankers and the liability and obligation for taking their money. The American people were not aware of the diabolical plot to take away their freedom, nor were they aware of the men responsible for their enslavement. The purpose of this paper is to expose and unmask the men behind the defeat and enslavement of the American people. Who were these people? Why weren't the American people listening to the encroachment on their freedom? To deny the identity of these bankers would be to deny history. It is not anti-Semitic to reveal the truth and the fact that those behind the defeat of America are a few power-hungry Jews. True, there are non-Jews involved, but the controlling power are those that control the world's finances. This paper is impartial. It has not been colored for or against any group of people. Jesus said, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." The following pages are merely the fruits of our history. The first recorded Jewish settler in Manhattan was a man named Jacob Bar Simpson, who arrived early in 1654. He was an Ashkenazic or German Jew. When the Jews came to New York, it was considered among such families as the Roosevelts, the Van Rensselaers, the Goulets, and the Morrises not to be Jewish. The Sephardic families of New York, descended from the St. Charles arrivals, also known as the Jewish Mayflower, include the Strausses, the Warburgs, the Aldriches, the Kuhns, the Loebs, the Lehmans, the Morgans, the Schiffs, the Hendrickses, the Cardosos, the Baruchs, the Lazaruses, the Nathans, the Solises, the Gomezes, the Lopezes, the Lindos, the Lombrosos, and the Seixases. The Roosevelts, Bayards, Van Cortlands, and Rhinelanders were in the sugar refining business. The Rhinelanders also sold crockery, and the Schulers were importers. The Verplanks were traders, and Clarksons and Beekmans and Van Zants were in the retail dry goods business. The Brevoorts and Goulets were ironmongers, and the Schermerhorns were ship chandlers. The Guggenheims are proud to say that they started on foot and amassed what may have been the single greatest fortune in America. The only fortune that may outweigh the Guggenheims is that of John D. Rockefeller. Records place Guggenheims in Lengnau, in Canton Aargau, in German-speaking northern Switzerland, as early as 1696. A document of that year refers to Der Jude Maren Guggenheim von Lengnau, and the family had probably come to Lengnau from a German town called Guggenheim, now Jugenheim, near Heidelberg. The Seligmans were a major American banking family. Haim Solomon, who had come from Poland, worked closely with William Morris and the Continental Congress as a broker, and helped raise a particularly large sum for the Revolution. For his services, he was given the official title of Broker to the Office of Finance. Even earlier, Jewish bankers had lent money to Lord Bellamont, a particularly improvident 18th century colonial governor of New York, helping to keep the colony financially on its feet. And New York's first Lutheran church was built with money advanced by Jewish bankers, among them Isaac Moses, who helped establish the Bank of North America in 1781. These are some of the main players, all of whom are Jews, in the deceit and treachery to enslave all non-Jews in America, who, I might add, took them in spite of their history that preceded them. The facts that follow expose what went on behind the scenes. They have referred to themselves as the 100, quote-unquote, as opposed to the, quote-unquote, 400. The 100 are a core group of Jews with German roots. The 400 are also Jews, but are considered to be beneath the 100 in status and mental ability. The Seligmans were the elite of the 100. They have been called the, quote, Jewish Grand Dukes, unquote. The 100 consider themselves to be the elite of the human race, and that all non-Jews are to be despised and are meant to be their slaves. Their Jewish Talmud, their religion, makes this fact clear. Their arrival in America began in the 1600s. As I said earlier, Alexander Hamilton was relentless in his pursuit of establishing the first Bank of the United States and the continued use of the international bankers' money. Was Alexander Hamilton who he claimed to be, a loyal American, or was he an agent working for the international bankers? The only way to find out is to examine known history. Alexander Hamilton was born Alexander Levine, of Jewish lineage, in St. Croix, the West Indies. After changing his name and his geographical situs, he entered the United States military. He was a staff duty officer for General George Washington. Hamilton emerged from the Revolutionary War as a lieutenant colonel, and on December 14, 1780, he married the second daughter of General Philip Schuyler's at the bride's home in Albany, New York. General Philip Schuyler's influence in New York politics was great. The bride's mother was Catherine Van Rensselaer, daughter of Colonel John R. Van Rensselaer, who was the son of Hendrik, the grandson of Kilian, the first patroon, heir to Baron Van Rothschild. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton's foremost objective was to make sure that there could be no doubt about the determination of the United States to pay its just debts. On January 14, 1790, he proposed that all outstanding loans be funded at their face value, even though many speculators would profit by this. Some members of Congress, who, as they voted for the funding bill, were not aware of the opportunity it gave them to reap a rich harvest. It has also been reported that there are documents in the British Museum that prove that Alexander Hamilton received payment from the Rothschilds for his dastardly deeds. Could this payment have been for his involvement in the establishment of a foreign bank in this country, and for convincing Congress to assume the state's debts, which would have created a debt obligation binding the United States government and the states to the international bankers? Alexander Hamilton boasted, quote, "A power over a man's subsistence amounts to a power over his will," unquote. Hamilton wished also to take over such of the debts incurred by the states themselves for the cause of independence as they had not yet paid. His object, again, was to place the states under such obligation as to ensure their support in the establishment of the first bank of the United States. The states' war debts amounted to over $18 million. Not all the states had debts to be taken over. Thus started the political precedent of perpetual debt and required contributions, i.e., taxes, to be passed on to those not responsible for the debt. Nor were the obligations spelled out to the state inhabitants. Hamilton won the debate for the first Bank of the United States when President Washington signed the Senate bill. The bank was to have a capital stock of $10 million, which was, for that time, a very large sum. Of this amount, 1/5 was to be subscribed by the United States, and the other 4/5 by private individuals. Hamilton's bank, which had been chartered for 20 years, was allowed to run out in 1811 in favor of the state banks. The bankers could not stand for their bank being closed. The House of Rothschild used their influence over Britain to bring about the War of 1812. The war increased the U.S. government's debt to such an extent that the taxes that were collected were less than 1/3 the amount to cover this debt. The remaining debt had to be covered by loans that were made by foreign bankers. By the end of the war, the government was virtually bankrupt. The state banks tried to bolster themselves by issuing paper money in excessive amounts, which created land speculation and a deflated dollar. Some members in Congress saw no choice but to propose the second Bank of the United States. In 1816, the second Bank of the United States was chartered. Quote, "The new bank would have a capital stock of $35 million. The United States government should subscribe 1/5 of the stock, private individuals the other 4/5, and the directors should be similarly apportioned. The bank should have a monopoly on the business of the United States and the national banking business. It might establish branch banks throughout the several states, and it might continue in operation for a period of 20 years. Unquote. It is obvious that the bankers had the Congress of the United States and the American people through proxy over a barrel. Congress agreed to give the bankers exclusive rights to all business done in the United States. All loans were guaranteed by the American people, with repayment to be made through the payment of taxes. For the valuable privileges the bank was to enjoy, it was required to pay to the government of the United States a bonus of $1,500,000. in 1818, the Bank of the United States began an all-out attack on the state banks in order to close them. The Bank of the United States collected the paper money of state banks, and after the state banks had paid out a sufficient amount of specie, in other words, their gold and silver deposits became low, the Bank of the United States would then demand payment in specie for the paper money the state banks had put in circulation. The international bankers knew that the state banks only kept $1 of gold and silver for every $12 of paper money that was loaned out by the state banks. The state banks that were attacked in such a manner would then have to call in their loans. Individuals who had borrowed from the targeted banks would be forced to raise what they owed by selling their property for whatever it would bring. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what the bankers were up to. The above banking policy would eventually put all gold and silver out of the state banks, leaving them at the mercy of the international bankers. This would also give the Bank of the United States a monopoly in banking, removing any competition. By bankrupting the state banks, the international bankers would destroy those Americans that had loans through the state banks, the farmer, the businessman, and the land speculators. The result, the transfer of this country's gold and silver resources and vast amounts of this country's most important asset, its land, to the bankers. Those involved with banking became subject to the bankers through these foreclosures at a national level. Who are these bankers, and how did they get a foothold in this country? The Bank of the United States was operated by Nicholas Biddle, a wealthy and aristocratic Philadelphian. The bank was in a flourishing condition when President Jackson took office. Biddle was employed by the Rothschilds, and he was a non-Jew. When the bank failed in 1837, he was soon forgotten by the bankers and died penniless and a pauper in 1844. President Jackson represented the anti-bank sentiment by the American people. Jackson said, quote, "I do not dislike your bank more than all banks, but ever since I read the history of the South Sea bubble, I have been afraid of banks." End quote. The South Sea Company was an English corporation chartered in 1711 with a monopoly on the Spanish-American trade. It attempted, in 1720, to underwrite the British national debt in return for a guaranteed interest rate of 5%. This introduced a period of unbridled speculation, not only in stocks of the South Sea Company, but in all sorts of stocks also. The bubble burst in November 1720 with disastrous consequences to a host of investors. Biddle made a number of Jackson men directors of branch banks, but he was unwilling to subject the welfare of the bank more fully to the hazards of questionable banking. His nervous apprehension, however, led him to seek the favor of Congress in a way almost equally open to question. In 1829, 34 members of Congress found it possible to borrow a total amount of $192,000 from the bank. In 1830, 52 congressmen borrowed a total of $322,000. In 1831, 59 congressmen borrowed a total of $478,000. Huge amounts of money were also made available to powerful newspaper editors, and it paid each year a generous retainer to Daniel Webster, who, as the bank's attorney and a member of its board of directors, saw nothing improper in representing its interests both in and out of Congress. Webster persuaded Biddle to request for the recharter of the bank before the election of 1832. Webster knew Congress would pass the bank bill because of the loans that were made to many of the congressmen. The bank bill passed and was promptly vetoed by President Jackson. Here is a portion of his veto speech. His reasoning is sound. Quote, "More than a fourth part of the stock is held by foreigners, and the residue is held by a few hundred of our citizens, chiefly of the richest class. Should the stock of the bank principally pass into the hands of the subjects of a foreign country, and we should unfortunately become involved in a war with that country, what would be our condition? If we must have a bank with private stockholders, every consideration of sound policy and every impulse of American feeling admonishes that it should be purely American." Unquote. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the United States Bank, said, quote, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken." Unquote. On January 30th, 1835, the bankers attempted to assassinate their fiercest enemy, President Jackson. Richard Lawrence, armed with 2 pistols, I'm surprised it's not Richard Lee Lawrence, right? Richard Lawrence, armed with 2 pistols at point-blank range, fired both pistols, both of which misfired, spoiling the bankers' plans. President Jackson said, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I shall kill the bank." With the re-election of President Jackson in 1836, he knew he had a mandate from the people of America. He feared the power of Biddle in persuading the Congress. In order to head off Biddle, Jackson, through his power given him under the Constitution, removed the money from the Bank of the United States and placed it in the state banks. In order to accomplish this, he had to fire 2 Secretary of the Treasurers. Their successor, Roger B. Taney of Maryland, did not hesitate to issue the order to remove the money. Biddle shut off the flow of money to the state banks in order to turn public opinion against Jackson's policies, against the Bank of the United States. The state banks began to loan excessive amounts of paper money, which again triggered land speculation. The state bank loans increased from $137 million in 1829 to $525 million in 1837. The land speculation was so bad that the government sales of public lands rose from 4 million acres in 1834 to 15 million in 1835 and to 20 million in 1836. Receipts from public lands had contributed to the Treasury only $4,800,000 in 1834, but in 1835 this item rose to $14,700,000, and in 1836 to $24,800,000. These banks had nothing better to do with the funds that poured into their vaults than to lend them out again, and in far too many instances the borrowers were mere speculators who bought more land. Thus an endless chain was fashioned. Payments made by the speculators to the United States were deposited into pet banks, then lent again to other speculators to buy more land, then paid once more into the Treasury, then redeposited, then lent again, and so on in a vicious circle. President Jackson decided the evil of this policy had to be stopped. In July 1836, it was declared in the Specie Circular that paper money could no longer be used to buy public lands, and that specie, i.e., gold and silver, had to be used. This ended for a number of years the purchase of land from the government. In 1835, the last dollar of public debt was paid off. In 1837, the United States was in the middle of a depression because the Bank of the United States had removed the gold and silver from the state banks, which meant they had no more specie money to loan. 1837 marked the end of the Bank of the United States, and in 1840 Congress passed the Sub-Treasury Bill. The only thing this accomplished was to remove the middleman between the United States government and the foreign bankers. August Belmont, i.e. Schoenberg, arrived in New York City in 1837 with the influence and backing of the House of Rothschild behind him. He was a Jewish banker of German descent. He had 3 sons, Perry, Oliver H.P., and August Jr. August Schoenberg, i.e. Belmont, went to Frankfurt at the age of 13 to work as an unpaid apprentice for the Rothschilds, the leading Jewish banking house in Europe. It is said among the European Rothschilds that August Schoenberg was the illegitimate son of Baron von Rothschild. The reason I believe this to be true is because the Jews are very clannish. They would not put a non-family member in such an important position, nor would a non-family member have direct access to Baron von Rothschild. Belmont married into the Perry family for their social influence. The Perrys were not very rich, but they had all the social contacts that Belmont wanted and needed, more than he needed money. Carolyn was the daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry, hero of the Mexican War, and the officer later credited with having, quote, opened Japan to the West, unquote. And her uncle was another naval commander, Oliver Hazard Perry, hero of the War of 1812 and the Battle of Lake Erie. The first thing New York society noticed about August Belmont was that he had a lot of money. It was Rothschild money, and he used it extravagantly. As a financier with the funds of the world's largest private bank at his fingertips, he was immediately important, not only to American companies, but to the United States government, which was always running out of cash and whose credit needed constant infusions from bankers. There was one area in which August Belmont excelled. Its name was Rothschild. Belmont was not known to be a spectacular, brilliant, or even interesting financier, but men like J.P. Morgan liked to work with the European Rothschilds, and August Belmont, as their agent, was always there, helpful, collecting his percentage on the money that passed back and forth. In the Panic of 1837, Belmont was able to perform a service which he would repeat in subsequent panics, and which helped make him a friend to bankers and to the United States government. By negotiating large loans from the Rothschilds, he was able to shore up United States debtor banks. In other words, he was able, thanks to the hugeness of the Rothschilds' reservoir of capital, to start out in America operating his own Federal Reserve System. Mayor Amschel Rothschild said, quote, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Unquote. In the years since his arrival, Belmont had been so successful at channeling Rothschild funds into the United States Treasury, in return for government securities, that he was rewarded, in 1844, by being appointed United States Consul General to Austria, a move designed not only to provide Mr. Belmont with prestige, but also to place him close to the Vienna House of Rothschild, where he could be of further usefulness. Things, of course, did not always go smoothly. When the state of Pennsylvania defaulted on $35 million worth of state bonds held by British investors, including the Rothschilds, Belmont, in Paris trying to place another U.S. federal government loan, was icily told by Baron de Rothschild, quote, "Tell them you have seen the man who is at the head of the finances of Europe, and that he has told you that they cannot borrow a dollar, not a dollar." Unquote. In 1853, he had been made United States Charge d'Affaires at The Hague, and from 1855 to 1858, he was the resident American minister there. Until the outbreak of the war, August Belmont had been financial advisor to the President of the United States. During the war's first months, Lincoln leaned on Belmont for Rothschild money as heavily as Gittermen and the Quartermaster Corps leaned on the Seligmans for uniforms. This placed Belmont in an awkward position. Reflecting the general frame of mind in Europe, the Rothschilds had grave doubts about the North's chances of winning, and gave Belmont and the United States Treasury only lukewarm and hesitant support. Lincoln's fundraisers were forced to look for new sources of supply, and found them in the bond-selling efforts of such men as Joseph Seligman. The recovery from the Panic of 1857 was as spectacular as the panic itself. The bubble had no sooner burst than it began to re-inflate. So much gold was pouring into New York from California that gold held in New York banks climbed from $8 million worth in October to $28 million 2 months later. And a $10 million loan from the Rothschilds made via August Belmont to bolster the credit of U.S. banks was repaid the same day. The Seligmans, who were an American banking house, had the same mission as the international bankers. Both banking houses were able to manipulate the American people through so-called bid rigging. The bankers funded the North and the South. William Seligman liked to say that he had predicted the Civil War, and implied that the nice position the Seligmans found themselves in as a result of the war was largely his doing. At the outbreak of the war, the United States Treasury was in greater shambles than Fort Sumter. Southern banks had been quietly withdrawing large amounts of funds on deposit in the North. When Lincoln took office, he found his treasury almost empty. The federal debt was increasing, and the American credit abroad was disappearing. Conservative businessmen wanted no deals whatever with the government. They considered it far too risky. Linton Wells, a former Seligman staff member, wrote that, quote, Joseph Seligman, during a visit with President Lincoln, persuaded Lincoln to put Grant in charge of the Union forces, unquote, which Lincoln, of course, did. These constitute sizable claims, and subsequent Seligman generations have cooperated with Wells and W.E. Dodd, parentheses, Dodd was Joseph's equal in selling bonds, end parentheses, cooperated in carrying on the legend that Joseph Seligman won the Civil War by paying for it. At one optimistic point, Joseph bought some Union bonds for his own portfolio, then quickly became discouraged about their prospects and wrote, quote, I am almost tempted to resell the U.S. stock which I bought and keep my hands clear of the present degenerated American race, unquote. Parentheses. Again, this is what these Jewish bankers thought about non-Jewish Americans, end parentheses. His brother James was more hopeful and wrote, suggesting that the brothers buy $100,000 worth of Union securities for their own accounts. Joseph turned him down. He said, quote, Do not be afraid, he answered, that the government will want no more money after the 1st of June, even if the South should have been whipped so badly as to make peace. The government will need hundreds, if not thousands of millions yet, to pay for claims of all description, and for the purpose of emancipating the Negro. End quote. This was one of the reasons for the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. By making the Negro a United States citizen, it would increase the debt of the United States and further enslave the non-Jewish American through the increased taxes that would have to be collected. Morgan, Belmont, and the Rothschilds formed an axis of financial power that Joseph Seligman was finding increasingly difficult to beat. This much of Joseph's Union bond selling is known. Early in Lincoln's second administration, in 1865, William Fessenden, who succeeded Chase as Secretary of the Treasury, announced a $400 million issue of new government notes. Joseph Seligman headed a group of German bankers in New York who wished to underwrite $50 million worth of these notes, but the Secretary would not accept the terms of the syndicate. Thereupon, the Seligman brothers took an active part in selling these federal securities themselves, and it is recorded that they sold over $60 million worth. Remember, these bonds were just like the government created the money out of thin air. These bankers knew that if they continued to underwrite these bonds, they would obtain a nation and its people for repayment. Obviously, this was the moment for Joseph to put his great plan to work. Within hours of Lee's surrender, Joseph had summoned his brothers together to organize the International Banking House of Seligman. Under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, the Seligmans enjoyed excellent relations with three successive secretaries of the Treasury: Salmon Chase, William Fessenden, and Hugh McCulloch. When their old friend from Waterton days, Ulysses S. Grant, took presidential office in 1869, they had every reason to look forward to the same preferential treatment. In the beginning, the possibilities certainly looked good. Grant appointed, as his Secretary of State, Elihu Washburne, who, as a congressman from Illinois, had been one of the Seligmans' private clients. Joseph had once purchased in Frankfurt $200,000 of U.S. bonds for Washburne, saying at the time, quote, "There is no necessity for you to send any bonds as margin, as we require none from you, dear Washburne." End quote. As soon as Washburne was appointed, the Seligmans wrote him, gently reminding him of their past good deeds and offering their full services to the new administration. But Washburne's appointment, it turned out, was only a courtesy one. He held the post for only 12 days and was then minister to France. Grant replaced him with Hamilton Fish, who was less a friend. Fish was the son of a Revolutionary War officer whose father had been a friend of George Washington, and whose mother was a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, who had once thrown every Jew in New York in jail. Then Grant did a startling thing. He contacted Joseph privately and said he would like to make him Secretary of the Treasury, but Joseph declined. Daniel Drew, a large stock manipulator, was able to force the price of Erie stock up and down at will. Why did Drew want his shares sold in London and not New York? So New York wouldn't find out about it for a while. Allied with Drew in his operations were two other terrors of the age: Jubilee Jim Fisk, a former circus roustabout, and an ex-farmhand who became the leader of the threesome named Jay Gould. Interesting. These are all the names, all of the culprits you encounter when you read the Watershed history book that's also suppressed now, History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, and I turned that one into an audio a year or two ago. These are all the same names. These are the names I came across then: Jim Fisk, Jay Gould, Daniel Drew, stock manipulators. At any rate, we'll stop it here. This will be part one of A Country Defeated in Victory by James Montgomery. Over and out. Bankrupted by a huge debt. Our forefathers made it clear, because of their experience and those of other countries, that we should never use paper money again. Here is a series of quotes. A quote by John Adams. Quote, "I am firmly of the opinion that there never was a paper pound, a paper dollar, or a paper promise of any kind that ever yet obtained the general currency as money but by force or fraud, generally by both, unquote. That again by John Adams. The following quote is by Count d'Estoute de Tracy, quote, "A theft of greater magnitude and still more ruinous is the making of paper money. It is greater because in this money there is absolutely no real value. It is more ruinous because, by its gradual depreciation during the time of its existence, it produces the effect which would be proration of the coins. All those iniquities are founded on the false idea the money is but a sign," unquote. That quote again by Count d'Estoute de Tracy. The following is a quote by George Washington. Quote, "If ever again our nation stumbles upon unfunded paper, it shall surely be like death to our body politic. This country will crash," unquote. That quote again by George Washington. Welcome again to Rejected Knowledge. Bunch of stuff that's irrefutably proven true that nearly everybody cannot accept. And as a result of all this rejected knowledge, of course, well, you know the rest. Read Hosea 4:6. At any rate, we're now going to get into another book by James Montgomery. This one is called A Country Defeated in Victory. I believe he wrote this book before he wrote any of the others I've presented to you. So let's get into this. Again, where does James Montgomery's work come from? Well, he was on atgpress.com. That stood for againstthegrainpress.com. That website is down, most lamentably. I hope somebody puts that back up. This is vital information. You can't understand, you literally cannot understand the nature of the nation, the nature of the slavery we're in, without this information. This guy did it. This guy, James Montgomery, spent years proving this. He did the wet work, so to speak. Him, and the Informer, those two guys. Knowledge is Freedom was the button you would click on the old ATG Press if you wanted to read James Montgomery's critical work, crucial work. At any rate, let's get to it. A Country Defeated in Victory by James Montgomery, Part 1. To understand the title of this paper, you must be made aware that the country I refer to is the United States. From Thomas Jefferson, quote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied," unquote. That quote again by Thomas Jefferson. On February 15th, 1791, Jefferson wrote to Washington to tell him his objections of the establishment of a national bank. The bill for establishing a national bank undertakes, among other things, 1. To form the subscribers into a corporation. 2. To enable them in their corporate capacities to receive grants of land, and so far is against the laws of mortmain. 3. To make alien subscribers capable of holding lands, and so far is against the laws of alienage. 4. To transmit these lands, on the death of a proprietor, to a certain line of successors, and so far changes the course of descents. 5. To put the lands out of the reach of forfeiture or escheat, and so far is against the laws of forfeiture and escheat. 6. To transmit personal chattels to successors in a certain line. A quote by C.C. Pinckney. That paper money corrupted the morals of the people. It had diverted them from the paths of honest industry to the ways of ruinous speculation. It had destroyed both public and private credit, and had brought total ruin on numberless widows and orphans. I apprehend these general reasonings will be found true with respect to paper money. That experience has shown that in every state where it has been practiced since the Revolution, it always carries the gold and silver out of the country and impoverishes it. Unquote. That quote by C.C. Pinckney. During the formation of the Constitution, there were pro-paper and anti-paper money advocates at work. The strongest proponent for the use of paper money and the establishment of the first Bank of the United States was Alexander Hamilton. Many of our forefathers, including Thomas Jefferson, were against the use of paper money and the establishment of a central bank. The proponents for paper money said this would be more cost-effective and convenient than using silver and gold coin. Those against the use of paper money said this would ruin the country through debt and plunge this country into bankruptcy and make the Americans subject to the bankers. The following is a quote. States, very few Americans are aware of the defeat of which it is my obligation to inform you of. President Lincoln, very wisely and correctly so, I might add, said that all the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not, by force, take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up from among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. Unquote. That by Abraham Lincoln. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Unquote. These patriarchs of our country understood the dangers of banking and the men that controlled the banking institutions. The enemy that defeated this country from the very beginning was the debt created by the use of paper money instead of gold and silver coin. The use of differing weights and measures caused this country to fall prey to the international bankers. Prior to the Constitution being written, the states printed paper money to finance the Revolutionary War. At the end of the war, the new United States found itself